Welcome, dear horror writer. It begins with something small, like a light left on that you don't remember switching, or a coffee cup that's in the wrong place. At first, you tell yourself that it's nothing, that you're probably just tired, but then you start forgetting conversations. People claim you said things you don't remember. You find unfamiliar bruises on your arms and scratches on the inside of your door. Then you hear your own voice whispering from another room. The mirrors show expressions you don't feel, and the more you try to hold on to what's real, the more it slips through your fingers. Your memories turn into fog, your home feels unfamiliar, and the face in your reflection watches you like it knows something you don't. Welcome to the world of psychological horror. Alright, so before we start, I have a companion video to psychological horror that explains how to write a character's descent into madness, so if you're interested in that, you can find it in the description below. Now, let's dive into the horror. So what is psychological horror? Psychological horror is a horror subgenre that doesn't rely on the grotesque or the supernatural narrative elements to unsettle us. Instead, it plants its terror in the mind, in the emotional and cognitive disintegration of characters, and usually by extension, the reader or viewer. This kind of horror comes not from what might be lurking in the shadows, but from what's already present in the psyche, like unhealed trauma, a memory that's been buried too deep, and the slow decay of a person's grasp on reality. At its core, psychological horror is the story of internal collapse, and instead of being about escaping a threat, rather it's about being unable to escape yourself. What makes psychological horror different from other forms of horror is its focus on inward tension rather than external danger. While slasher films, creature features, or supernatural terrors that rely on visible threats like killers, monsters, and ghosts, psychological horror works through subtlety, suggestion, and emotional instability. And the most terrifying moments in psychological horror are often quiet, intimate, and slow burning. They happen in isolation, in the mind's darkest corners, and where no one else can intervene. Unlike typical horror, which usually uses death, violence, or the unknown as its primary source of fear, psychological horror deals in dread, paranoia, guilt, grief, and helplessness. And these emotions, while they are elements of the story, they're also the story. A character in a psychological horror narrative may never be physically harmed at all throughout the story, and yet by the end, they might be completely destroyed, mentally fragmented, emotionally ruined, or no longer able to tell the difference between what's real and what's imagined. Now, this subgenre usually walks the line between horror, drama, gothic horror, and thriller. And actually, a lot of great psychological stories can easily be classified in multiple ways. Like, take The Babadook and Hereditary, for example, which are two of my favorites for this because they show this off so well. On the surface, The Babadook is a monster story, but the horror is deeply tied to the mother's unresolved grief and psychological deterioration. And Hereditary involves demonic forces, but the real horror lies in the family's unraveling mental state and how trauma ripples down through generations. The Yellow Wallpaper by Perkins Gilman, which I state is one of the most enduring early examples of psychological horror in literature, never gives us a literal ghost, yet it is deeply terrifying. Here, the horror comes as the protagonist loses her mind as she's being isolated and thrown away by those around her. Other examples like The Shining, which is my love, by Stephen King, and The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson also show how psychological horror frequently disguises itself in the trimmings of supernatural or haunted house tales, only to slowly reveal that the most horrifying aspect is the crumbling of the human mind. In The Shining, is it the Overlook Hotel that's haunted, or is it Jack's descent into violence and madness inevitable, which has been spurred on by isolation in dealing with his addiction? And in Hill House, is Eleanor being haunted by spirits, or is she experiencing a long overdue break from reality? All in all, psychological horror is about what happens when a person's internal world becomes more dangerous than the external one. It's horror rooted in subjectivity, in perception, memory, emotion, and identity. These stories ask us to inhabit the minds of characters who are unraveling to witness fear and horror as something growing within them. And as a writer, psychological horror gives you the opportunity to explore the deeply human and often deeply painful realities that lurk beneath the surface of normal life. It's the horror of the mind turning against itself and of the truth becoming too heavy to bear. Now, psychological horror is one of my all-time favorite subgenres, and for good reason. It leans heavily on psychology, and as the name suggests, and it gives you the chance to peel back the layers of the human mind. It's kind of like you're stepping into the role of an evil mastermind, unraveling someone piece by piece. But all of that aside, what actually makes this kind of horror so effective? Let's break it down. So, what makes psychological horror so effective is that it begins with the truth that fear is deeply personal. A jump scare might create a brief psychological reaction, but psychological horror resonates because it speaks to the fears that we carry privately, which are ones we more than often not try to suppress. The terror in these stories grows slowly, methodically, like a thought you can't unthink. It emerges from things we don't talk about, the memories we don't visit, the parts of ourselves we'd rather not examine. It's this quiet, creeping progression that makes psychological horror feel so disturbing, because what's happening here is that there's no safe distance between the reader and the horror, because the horror is tied to real life experiences like grief, guilt, trauma, loneliness, and shame. The things we all know about a little too well, whether consciously or unconsciously. This makes psychological horror intimate in a way few other genres can match. And when it's crafted well, the horror feels uniquely tailored to the character, and so much so that it ends up feeling tailored to the reader. And that experience becomes a mirror. If the protagonist is grieving a child, the reader is forced to consider how they would handle that grief. If the character is slowly unraveling under the weight of guilt, the reader feels the echo of their own regrets that they have. This intimacy between character and reader is what gives psychological horror its staying power, because those thoughts and emotions don't end when the final scene fades to black or the last page turns, but it lingers because it feels true, even if the events are fictional or surreal. Another reason why psychological horror works so well is because it's socially and culturally relevant. The themes that power this subgenre, like mental illness, trauma, repression, grief, abuse, aren't abstract or fantastical, but they're part of the human experience. Psychological horror reflects our anxieties back to us in distorted, poetic, or surreal forms, but it's still our world we're looking at. In a time when conversations around mental health are growing louder, psychological horror becomes even more potent. It gives shape to feelings many people struggle to articulate. It transforms personal suffering into shared stories, and in doing so, it validates those feelings while also terrifying us with their intensity. So why does psychological horror work? Because it feels like the truth we're too afraid to name. It works because it doesn't rely on spectacle, but it relies on humanity, on wounds we've all carried, fears we've all had, and the quiet terror that maybe we're not as in control as we think. This genre peels back the protective layers we use to get through the day and exposes the raw nerves underneath. And once it does, it doesn't let go. At the heart of every effective psychological horror story, there are four pillars that hold up the terror with emotional gravity, existential unease, and the slow erosion of certainty. These are the engines that drive psychological horror, guiding the character's descent and shaping the reader's dread. And understanding how to use these elements in your writing is essential to mastering the subgenre. The first and most important pillar that we have is the unreliable mind. In psychological horror, as you probably guessed by now, the mind is never a trustworthy narrator, not for the character and especially not for the reader. What we're told, shown, or led to believe is always being questioned. This unreliability can come from mental illness, trauma, grief, addiction, sleep deprivation, or even deliberate deception. The character might be hallucinating, repressing memories, or misinterpreting reality. And as a writer, you can use those elements to manipulate tension. When a reader can't trust the main character's perception, they're drawn deeper into the story, grasping for truth, and are only met with more ambiguity. By creating this destabilization, it keeps them off balance, anxious, and invested in the story. Psychological horror at its most disturbing level asks the reader to sit inside the breaking mind and feel the crack spread. Closely tied to this is the second pillar, which is isolation and internal conflict. Characters in psychological horror are almost always alone in some way, whether physically, emotionally, or socially. Sometimes they're literally cut off from the world, like being trapped in a house, a relationship, or a memory. Other times they're surrounded by people who cannot or will not see what's happening to them. This isolation amplifies their internal conflict, creating a pressure cooker environment where guilt, shame, fear, and repression intensify. Now, gaslighting is a common feature of psychological horror because it reflects a reality where even one's own memory can't be trusted, especially when everyone around you insists that you're imagining things. The emotional weight of this conflict builds tension more effectively than any chase scene ever could, because it's about what you're hiding from inside your own head and the dawning horror that you might not survive it. The third pillar is the breakdown of reality. This is where psychological horror overlaps with surrealism and even the uncanny. As the story progresses, the line between what is real and what is imagined begins to dissolve. Objects move without explanation, time slips, people speak in riddles, dreams and memories intrude on waking life. But it's important to remember that these hallucinations shouldn't just be there to add shock or strangeness to your story, but they need to reflect the protagonist's psychological unraveling, because that's what's actually happening here. The fractured mind perceives a fractured world, and the reader, pulled into this shifting reality, starts to question everything they thought they understood. And the more the character tries to cling to the stable version of events, the more that version begins to fall apart. This creates a slow, creeping fear that fear will not just be that something is wrong, but that everything might just be. Finally, we have the most intimate and terrifying pillar, which is the fear of the self. As I mentioned before, at the heart of many psychological horror stories, there lies the revelation that the true threat isn't external. It's not the ghost in the mirror while you're brushing your teeth or the killer in the hallway coming at you with a knife, but it's you. Or more precisely, it's the part of you tried to bury, deny, or forget. Here we're dealing with the monstrous self. So think of the violent impulse, the hidden memory, the guilt too heavy to acknowledge. All of that comes rising to the surface. Now, this type of horror is deeply existential. It forces the character to confront who they really are and to reckon with the possibility that they might be the true source of the horror they've been experiencing. That they're not being haunted, but they're the haunting themselves. This is where psychological horror departs most heavily from other subgenres, because in a slasher you can run from the killer, but in psychological horror you can run in circles until you realize that the thing you're running from is wearing your face. When all four of these pillars work together, they create a story that quietly unravels your readers. It lingers long after they tuck the story away, burrowing into their thoughts and resurfacing during sleepless nights and moments of quiet. Unlike other horror subgenres that center the story around a monster, a haunted house, or a masked killer, psychological horror builds itself around the mind of your main character. Their fragile, flawed, and deeply human perspective becomes the lens through which everything unfolds. In this type of horror, character is the foundation. Their inner world shapes the atmosphere, drives attention, and defines the horror. The psyche becomes the setting, the stakes, the antagonist, and usually the most terrifying force in the story. Now, everything in psychological horror revolves around perception. What your character fears, remembers, hides, or refuses to accept shapes the entire tone and trajectory of the narrative. Fear in this subgenre, rather than being a passive reaction, is a personal revelation. The things that your character dreads reveals their deepest insecurities and unresolved traumas. And that fear isn't random, but a reflection of who they are beneath their surface identity. Like, say they have a fear of losing a child, then that could point towards unresolved grief. Or a fear of being watched can suggest that they have guilt or paranoia. Or a fear of going insane might be masking a repressed truth about themselves that's been crawling its way to the surface for years now, and that soon it's going to show itself. So to write effective psychological horror, you need to create protagonists who carry weight. They should be emotionally complex and psychologically volatile. So give them secrets. Give them something they don't want to remember. Give them guilt they can't name or trauma they've minimized for years. Let them cling to routines, relationships, or beliefs that are clearly unstable. Let them be obsessive, selfish, withdrawn, or too curious for their own good. Psychological horror is not the subgenre where your characters need to be liked or have tidy moral arcs. The audience just needs to feel your character. They need to believe they're real, even if they're unstable, morally gray, or deeply broken. Now, because I love The Shining, let's look at Jack Torrance, who is a perfect example for this. Jack walks into the Overlook Hotel already a broken man. He's a recovering alcoholic with a violent past, clinging to the hope that the isolation will somehow fix his life. But it doesn't. Instead, the hotel reveals him. His descent is messy, irrational, and terrifying, and not just because of what's happening around him, but because of what's already inside of him. That's the kind of character psychological horror thrives on. Not a hero, not someone who needs to survive, but someone who is slowly becoming the thing we fear. So when you're watching or reading a psychological horror, you'll notice that many of their protagonists make irrational or even immoral decisions. And that's part of what makes them so compelling. Whether they choose to stay in the haunted house, betray someone they love, or spiral into addiction, or push away the very people trying to help them, their choices should reflect their psychological fragmentation. And these characters don't need to win or survive. They don't need to be final girls, heroes, or have redemption arcs. Sometimes they're unreliable. Sometimes they're passive. And sometimes they're the source of the horror, even if they don't realize it until the final moments. And speaking of unreliable, that brings us to one of the best narrative tools in psychological horror, which is the unreliable narrator. In this subgenre, the narrator usually can't be trusted, and not just because they're deceptive by nature, but because they're mentally falling apart. They might be hallucinating, they might be repressing memories, they might be twisting reality to protect themselves or reshaping events to avoid guilt. Their version of the truth is fragile, and that's exactly what makes them so compelling. But writing an unreliable narrator well can be tricky because it requires a lot of balance. If you're too obvious, then your readers will quickly catch on to what's happening, you'll lose the mystery, and the reader might disconnect completely from your story. And if you're too subtle, then your readers might entirely miss your clues and they might feel confused rather than intrigued. The key to avoiding this is to build their unreliability gradually. Don't tell your reader that something is wrong, but instead let them feel that something is wrong. Let small inconsistencies slip through the cracks. Show moments where the protagonist insists on something the reader suspects isn't true. Give us memories that don't align, actions that contradict internal thoughts, dialogue that hints that others see things differently than the protagonist. And the most important thing is that you want to let the narrator believe that they're actually telling the truth, no matter how subtle or out there it is, because that sincerity makes their unraveling even more disturbing. So if you're going to use an unreliable narrator in your story, then here's an exercise that you can try. So you're going to write two versions of the same event. One is going to be as the narrator perceives it, and the other is going to be as it might have actually happened. Then blend them subtly into your story. By doing this, you're not giving away the truth, but rather suggesting to the reader that there might be one. Another technique that is great for psychological horror is the spiraling character arc. Here, this isn't a steady descent into madness, but a messy, chaotic, and often repetitive descent. The character may think they've regained control, only to find themselves spiraling deeper. Their moments of clarity are fleeting. Their attempts to try and fix things only make the situation worse. And it's that roller coaster of unpredictability that keeps the tension high, because the reader is constantly shifting between hope and dread, watching the protagonist teeter on the edge, just waiting for them to fall. So if you're going to write a spiraling arc, you want to avoid neat plot beats. Let the character take one step forward and then two steps back, and show how each moment of insight leads to more confusion. Give them moments where they almost escape the horror, only to turn back, sabotage themselves, or realize they never left the horror in the first place. That push and pull is where the real fear lives. You can also use layered points of view to deepen psychological dissonance in your story. Whether you're writing in first first person, third person, or switching in between different perspectives, the way you structure the narrative can reflect your character's unraveling mind. A first person point of view might feel emotionally raw and intimate, but still leave out critical details the character doesn't want to face. While a third person perspective can echo the protagonist's denial, keeping the reader in the dark about important truths until it's too late to change anything. You can even play with forms like journal entries, therapy transcripts, confessions, or recorded messages to blur the line between what's real and what's remembered. And if you use them well, then these techniques will make your story feel fractured in all the right ways. So as you can see, writing a protagonist in psychological horror is about creating a character whose inner world is already fragile and then watching what happens when pressure is applied. Your story doesn't need a villain when your character is already haunted by themselves. It doesn't need a twist ending when the truth is slowly bleeding through every page. So build your story around the mind of your protagonist. Let their emotional unraveling dictate the plot. And remember, in psychological horror, the scariest thing isn't what happens to your character, but it's about what they may do to themselves. Now it's time that we explore the beating heart of your story, which are the scenes themselves. So as we've established, psychological horror as a subgenre creeps, coils, and it starts in the pit of the stomach with a subtle sense that something isn't quite right. So when you're writing psychological horror scenes, the first and most important thing to do is understand that dread always comes before fear, because you're writing erosion, not explosion. And that means your scenes need to make the reader feel like something is off long before they realize they're afraid. So let's start with the first building block, which is unease. Unease is where everything begins, and to create it, you're going to let the mood simmer like a low, constant hum. This could be as simple as a sound that won't go away, a conversation that doesn't quite make sense, or a character noticing something they can't name, but can't stop noticing it. The fear here should feel like fog that's rolling in, that's slow, lingering, and escapable. And by the time the reader feels it fully, they should already be surrounded. To do this effectively, your greatest tool is using detail that's claustrophobic. So you're going to focus on small, mundane elements of a scene, but let them repeat, distort, or take on new meaning as the story progresses. For example, a character might notice that their light switch seems a bit off kilter, and at first they brush it off, but the next day it's tilted further. Then they realize that they've been turning the lights on and off without remembering doing so. And that light switch in its eerie stillness becomes a symbol of mental unraveling. This is essentially how psychological horror works. It's that it takes the ordinary and tightens it around the character like a noose. Now let's talk about tension. Tension in your scenes should rise internally, not externally, because as we've talked about before, the story is revolving around your protagonist, and therefore the tension is always growing within them. Their thoughts become circular. They begin to doubt what they saw. They misremember events. They hear things that no one else hears, like distant whispers, voices calling their name, someone saying something behind them for no one to be there. You can even play with a dialogue and distort it. Maybe what someone said doesn't match what the character remembers them saying, or maybe that person denies the conversation ever took place and it was actually with someone else. These kinds of subtle fractures in reality are how you build pressure until even the reader starts to question what's real. Now, as we're on the subject of reality, psychological horror thrives when the boundaries of perception begin to slip. And readers should feel unsteady inside your scenes because they're unsure of whether what they're reading is truly happening or not. And to do that, let objects appear where they shouldn't be. Let time skip or drag. Let memories bleed into the present. But an important thing here is that don't spell it out too clearly for your reader. Let the strange things creep in slowly, almost quietly, like a photograph that looks slightly different every time the character sees it, or a sound that follows them from room to room no matter where they go. These moments shouldn't be explained because that's part of their power. And the second you explain the strange things happening, it stops being unsettling. A good way to remember this is that mystery is what gets under the skin and certainty is what pulls it right back out. Another essential tool is sensory distortion. Psychological horror is most effective when what the character experiences doesn't match what they know. Like a familiar room where their bedroom might smell wrong. A lover's voice may suddenly sound distant or robotic. A child's laughter might seem to come from inside the walls. What you're doing here is taking familiar senses and making them untrustworthy. So vision, sound, touch, even taste can all be used to destabilize the character and the reader simultaneously. And when you use these distortions carefully, with just a moment here and a fragment there, they gradually begin to accumulate and add unbearable weight to even the most ordinary scenes. And finally, here's the golden rule for your scenes. Show instead of explaining mental collapse. Don't have a character say that they're losing their mind. Instead, show the character losing their mind. Let it bleed through in the way they speak, the way they narrate, the way they interact with others. A protagonist who forgets what they were doing halfway through a sentence, who writes something down only to find it erased minutes later, who insists they've seen something only for everyone around them to look blank. These moments communicate disintegration without spelling it out. So let the reader feel the disorientation, let them experience the spiral firsthand. And the less you explain, the more disturbed they'll be. So my audio decided to cut out, so here we are, day 2. Now, as a subgenre, psychological horror draws its power from the darkest corners of the human condition. It's a subgenre that's less interested in what's scary and more focused on why we're afraid in the first place. And as human beings, we're complicated and carry a wide range of emotions. And while it might be interesting and fun to throw a bunch of emotions and themes into your story, but the best psychological horror stories focus on 1 or 2 central themes and dig into them until it hurts. So before you start writing, ask yourself, what emotional wound am I really exploring here? What fear is at the heart of this story, and why does it matter? So let's break down some of the themes that you can work with. So first we have madness, which is probably the genre's most recognizable theme. And when we're talking about madness, it's not just simply slapping mental illness onto your characters and calling it a day, but it's about perception of losing control over your mind. Whether it's psychosis, delusion, or a complete break from reality, the idea that your thoughts no longer belong to you is one of the most terrifying possibilities imaginable, because like your body, your mind belongs to you. And when what belongs to you becomes unstable, when you can no longer trust what you think, feel, or remember, it creates a horror that's deeply personal and impossible to escape. For example, in the film Bug, it shows 2 people who feed into each other's paranoia until they spiral into shared delusion. And we can also look at Clean Shaven, which is a quiet, haunting look at a man trying to make sense of a world that no longer makes sense to him. And a little side note here, please remember, and I can't stress enough, to do your research and approach any portrayal of mental illness that you might use in your stories with care and respect. Next, we have grief. While you can find grief in many horror subgenres, it's especially prominent in psychological horror. And sadly, it's an emotion that a lot of us can relate to. In psychological horror, grief isn't just about a character losing a loved one, but it's the slow unraveling that follows that loss, the way death distorts memory, identity, and reality itself. In some cases, grief can even trigger psychosis in some people, and horror leans into that. In horror, grief becomes an active force. It lingers, it haunts, it devours, and it refuses to be buried no matter how hard the character tries to move on. We can see this in The Night House, where a woman starts uncovering disturbing secrets about her dead husband, and grief starts bleeding into fear. Don't Look Now is another one, and it's about a couple mourning the death of their daughter, and they keep seeing things they can't explain, and their sorrow leads them down a dark path. And now there's shame, and shame is an emotion that corrodes from within. It's the horror of being seen and of being known too intimately. Unlike guilt, which is about what you've done, shame is about who you are. It makes characters hide things even from themselves. And in psychological horror, what's hidden always finds its way out. For example, in The Invitation, the main character is holding on to this tension and unease after a tragic event, and that shame infects the whole dinner party. The Canal is another one where a man's guilt and shame over his failing marriage begins to distort reality. Fourth is repressed trauma, and it's a goldmine for this subgenre. Stories that revolve around buried memories, childhood horrors, or unspeakable acts allow you to build tension in your narrative through flashbacks, nightmares, and creeping recollections. When something is too terrible to remember, the horror is the event itself, and also the fact that the mind refuses to let it go. Two good examples of this are Session 9 and The Perfection. Now we have guilt, and as I've mentioned before, guilt turns a character's own conscience into a source of fear. It manifests itself through hallucinations, paranoia, or a constant need to self-punish. Guilt also distorts the world, twisting the present through the lens of a crime the character can't forgive themselves for. When you're writing about guilt, sometimes it shifts the story from escaping the monster to atoning for what the monster has done. A great example of this is The Machinist, where the main character hasn't slept in a year and you slowly realize that he's running from something inside him. Everything he does, everything he sees is shaped by this guilt. Loss of identity is the next one, and it can be one of the most chilling forms of psychological horror. When a person no longer recognizes who they are, when their senses of self begin to splinter, it opens the door to stories about body swapping, amnesia, impersonation, or the slow, quiet horror of becoming someone else. This is also a theme that you find explored a lot in body horror, and a great example of psychological loss of identity is Perfect Blue, where a pop singer's sense of reality starts to fall apart as she tries to reinvent herself. Next is powerlessness, and it speaks to characters trapped in environments that they can't escape. Whether they're being gaslit, controlled, or disbelieved, psychological horror loves to explore situations where the protagonist's agency is gradually being stripped away. They scream, but no one listens. They fight, but the rules keep changing. And in the end, it's their despair that tarnishes them. Two great examples of powerlessness are Unsane and We Need to Talk About Kevin. Another theme is the monstrous feminine, which includes themes of motherhood, gender, and bodily autonomy. And it's become a major theme in modern psychological horror. From Rosemary's Baby to Saint Maud, these stories usually explore the horror of being trapped inside a body that feels alien, being expected to conform to roles that destroy the self, or being punished for feminine power. Here, gendered expectations become cages, and horror thrives in cages. Next are two cheeky ones, which are obsession and voyeurism, and they tap into the fear of being watched or of the one who can't stop watching. Whether it's a stalker or surveillance culture or even social media, the idea that privacy no longer exists creates perfect space for psychological horror. The more we stare into the lives of others, the less clear our own becomes. Two great examples of this are Caché and Cam. And lastly is mental illness and inherited psychosis, which brings generational trauma into focus. These stories ask, what if madness runs in the family? What if you're not just haunted by ghosts, but by blood, or by the idea that we're always destined to unravel? These themes are common in gothic horror stories, where the horror is the crumbling mansion, but also the people that live inside them. And one of the best examples portraying this is Hereditary and also The Others. And that, dear scribes of the strange and unsettling, is psychological horror. If you found this video helpful, please show it some love by giving it a like. And if you want more deep dives like this, be sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Until then, bye-bye.